I always believed that after 50 years of marriage, there were no more secrets left between us. We'd shared everything, from the cramped apartment of our youth to the creaking old house where I still wake up alone. I thought I knew the man I'd spent my entire life loving. But a few months after he passed, when I opened the cedar trunk in the attic, my trembling hands brushed against something that shattered everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and war. It began innocently enough. I was sorting through his uniforms, medals, and letters from his army days. The smell of mothballs and dust hung thick in the air, and I remember whispering to myself, "You always kept your things so neat, Robert." I smiled then, nostalgic, until my fingers caught the edge of a false bottom beneath the lining of the trunk. It was thin, cleverly built, something only a soldier would think to do. I pried it open, and inside was a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting stopped my breath. It wasn't mine. Each envelope began with, "My dearest husband." The words felt like knives. Husband. My husband. For a long moment I couldn't move. The wind rattled the attic window, and the wooden floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I wanted to believe they were letters from some delusional admirer, some stranger who'd mistaken him for another man. But then I saw his name, Captain Robert Hayes, written so carefully, as though the writer had kissed every letter. And below it, a signature, Eliza. I sat down on the dusty floorboards, the letters heavy in my lap. My fingers trembled as I untied the ribbon and opened the first one. March 3rd, 1945. My dearest husband. The bombs fell again last night, but I thought of you and it gave me strength. I hold the memory of our wedding day close. It feels like a dream. They said the war would end soon. I pray you'll come back to me before the lilacs bloom again. Love always, your wife, Eliza. Wife. The word made my skin crawl. My Robert, married to someone else? During the war? I must have sat there for hours, reading letter after letter, my heart pounding like a drum. Eliza wrote about waiting for him in a small English village near the coast. She spoke of ration lines, of the night they danced after he proposed under a broken street lamp. She spoke of their wedding, her wearing her mother's veil, him promising to return after the war. But he did return. To me. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, clutching his photograph, whispering, "Who were you, really?" The house creaked in the silence, and I thought I could almost hear him laughing softly in another room, as though mocking me from beyond the grave. I tried to hate him, but every memory, every Sunday breakfast, every gentle hand on my shoulder fought against that hate. The next morning I went back to the trunk and found a smaller envelope, sealed in red wax. It had no stamp, no date, just one line on the front in Robert's handwriting. To be opened if I never return. My breath caught. The seal broke easily, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Inside was a short letter, just a few lines. "If you're reading this, I never made it home. Tell Eliza I kept my promise. I'll love her until the end. R." But he did make it home. He made it home to me. I dropped the letter, my knees buckling. Suddenly, 50 years of our marriage flashed before me in cruel fragments. The way he'd flinched whenever I mentioned England, how he'd always avoided anniversaries in March, how he never wanted to travel back to Europe even when we could afford it. I thought it was grief from the war. Now I saw it for what it was. Guilt. For days I wandered the house like a ghost. Our daughter called, asking if I was eating. I lied. How could I tell her that her father might have had another wife, another life? That our entire existence might have been built upon a lie buried in a wooden trunk? Then, as though fate were taunting me, the local museum announced an exhibition on soldiers of the 1940s. They digitized letters, photos, and war records. My heart told me not to go, but curiosity, no, obsession, dragged me there. I typed Captain Robert Hayes into the search bar, and there it was, a marriage record. 1944, Hampshire, England. Bride, Eliza Turner. I remember gripping the edge of the computer table until my knuckles turned white. The attendant asked if I was all right, and I smiled, a twisted, broken smile, and said, "Yes, I've just found someone I lost a long time ago." That night, I went through the letters again. In the final one, dated 1946, Eliza wrote, "I heard rumours that your ship sank. I cannot believe you're gone. If there is any mercy in this world, let us meet in the next." Her handwriting grew faint toward the end, smudged with tears. She truly believed he was dead. Maybe he was to her, but I wasn't satisfied. Something inside me needed to know what happened to her. Who was this woman who'd shared vows with my husband while I waited back home, writing to the same man who promised me forever? The war had taken many things, but could it have taken his conscience too? The next morning I packed my bag. For the first time in my life, I booked a ticket to England. As the plane lifted off the ground, I stared out at the fading lights below and whispered, "Robert, whatever truth you buried, I will dig it out, even if it kills me." The flight to London felt endless. Every hum of the engines, every flicker of turbulence pulled me deeper into thoughts I had tried to suppress. Robert had always told me the war took too much to talk about. I used to think it was blood and death he couldn't bear to recall. Now I wondered if it was love. A forbidden, buried love that haunted him even as he built a new life beside me. When I landed, England felt cold in a way that went beyond weather. The sky was the colour of tin, and a thin mist rolled over the fields like ghosts that never rested. I took a train to Hampshire, the name that had appeared in her letters. It was a small village, the kind that still smelled of coal smoke and wet grass, where the church bell rang at noon and the streets seemed too narrow for modern cars. At the local records office, I introduced myself as a researcher. My voice trembled, but the young clerk didn't notice. When I asked for marriage records from 1944, he flipped through dusty ledgers and paused. "Captain Robert Hayes and Miss Eliza Turner," he read aloud, squinting. "Married on March 3rd, 1944. Witnessed by Reverend Thomas Avery and Nurse Margaret Cole." There it was. My husband's name, carved into history beside another woman's. I thanked him with a shaking smile and walked outside, where the rain began to fall softly. I wanted to scream, but the village was so quiet it felt like shouting would wake the dead. Next, I went to the small church listed on the record. Its stone walls were moss-covered, its wooden door worn by time. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of candle wax and lilies. I found the priest, an elderly man with kind eyes, who told me Reverend Avery had passed long ago, but he remembered the story. "Ah, yes," he said, "the soldier and the English girl. They married right before he shipped out. Poor thing waited for him years after the war, never remarried, died a recluse." My heart clenched. "Do you know where she's buried?" He nodded slowly and pointed out the window toward a small cemetery behind the church. I walked there alone, the wet grass soaking through my shoes. It didn't take long to find her. Eliza Turner Hayes, 1922 to 1948, beloved wife, waiting still. 48. She died young. The year, 1948, just 2 years after the last letter. My knees buckled as I read the inscription again. Beloved wife. She truly believed he was gone, and he had never told me, never told anyone. I knelt by her grave, my tears mixing with the rain. "He came home," I whispered. "He came home to me." My voice cracked under the weight of guilt and rage. "I'm sorry, Eliza, I didn't know." A gust of wind scattered the fallen leaves, and for a moment, I imagined her standing there, young, hopeful, waiting in her white veil. A ghost of a woman who had lived and died, believing in a promise my husband had broken. That night, I couldn't sleep in the inn. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their names together on that headstone. I saw him standing at the altar with her, saying vows that I thought belonged only to me. In the morning, I returned to the church to look through the archives. The priest allowed me access to a box of wartime documents, wedding records, letters, even some newspaper clippings. That's when I found it, an old article titled, "Local Hero Presumed Dead at Sea." It was Robert's name again, Captain Hayes, lost when his ship was attacked off the French coast in 1945. His picture was right there, his army uniform, his confident smile. I traced the image with my fingers, feeling betrayed by even his face. So that was how he'd done it. The military had declared him dead. She had mourned him, buried his memory. But he hadn't died. He'd come back and simply started over, with me. The realization made me feel sick. Our wedding had been in 1949, the year after Eliza's death. Had he waited until she was gone? Or had he known she'd die? I found myself whispering, "Did you write her after the war, Robert? Did you see her? Did you watch her grieve for a ghost?" The next clue came unexpectedly. In the church's donation ledger, beneath a long list of names, was an entry from 1951. Anonymous benefactor, $500, in memory of Eliza T. Hayes. I knew that handwriting, my husband's slanted letters, the same way he'd write on birthday cards to me. He hadn't forgotten her, even after all those years. I stumbled outside into the grey afternoon. Everything around me seemed unreal. The church bell tolled, distant and hollow, and for a moment I thought of the night before our own wedding. He'd seemed quiet then, withdrawn. When I asked if he was nervous, he'd just smiled sadly and said, "Some ghosts never stop whispering, darling." I'd laughed back then, thinking it was poetic. Now it felt like a confession I'd never understood. Before leaving the village, I stopped at a small post office that looked like it hadn't changed in a century. I asked if there were any wartime archives, and the old clerk nodded. He handed me a bundle of returned mail. "Found these years ago in storage," he said. "Letters that never reached their soldiers. Some wives used to come here, hoping." I flipped through them and froze. One envelope had his name, Captain Robert Hayes. Return to sender. The letter was from Eliza, dated February 1946, her last letter. The one I'd already read a copy of from the trunk. But this was the real one, never delivered, returned because he was listed as deceased. My breath caught. That meant he never saw it. He never knew she was alive when he came back. He probably believed she had moved on, or maybe even died during the war. And she believed he was gone forever. Two people trapped by lies of war, both left to grieve ghosts of each other, until he met me. That thought twisted my heart in ways I couldn't name, because now, for the first time, I wondered if I had been his second chance, or his greatest sin. When I boarded the plane home, I carried one of her letters with me, the one that ended with, "If there is any mercy in this world, let us meet in the next." For the rest of the flight, I stared out the window at the endless grey clouds and whispered to the man I thought I knew, "I'm coming home, Robert, but you won't rest until I know everything." When I returned home, the house felt colder than before, as if it too knew what I'd uncovered. The framed wedding photo on the mantel suddenly seemed like a lie, a performance captured in silver and smiles. His eyes, once so warm, now looked like they were hiding something I'd been too naive to see. For days, I couldn't bring myself to touch his things, but the questions wouldn't stop echoing. If Robert truly thought Eliza had died, why hide the letters? Why keep them secret for decades? Why never tell me he'd been married before? Late one night, I found myself standing again in front of his study door. It had always been his private space, Even after his death, I'd barely gone inside. But now, I turned the brass handle and stepped in. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old books, and the grandfather clock in the corner ticked with unsettling precision, like a heartbeat counting down. I opened drawer after drawer, bank statements, old maps, photographs of us in our early years. Then, in the bottom of his desk, I found a small, locked wooden box. My chest tightened. The key wasn't far. It was taped underneath the drawer, as if he expected someone to find it someday. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to slice through the silence. Inside were a few photographs, a ring wrapped in a handkerchief, and a stack of letters. My breath caught when I unfolded the handkerchief. It was delicate, embroidered with the initials E.T. The ring was small, golden, and clearly old, with a faint engraving inside. Forever, R and E. I clutched it in my fist, tears blurring my vision. It was her wedding ring. He'd kept it all these years. The letters beneath it were in his handwriting, unsent drafts addressed to "My dearest Eliza." My hands shook as I read the first one. "Eliza, I returned, but I found only your grave. I wanted to write sooner, but I couldn't bear the truth. The war took everything, and I came back a man I no longer recognized. Forgive me, my love. You waited, and I failed you." Another read, "Sometimes, when I wake beside her, I almost see you in her smile. I tell myself it's wrong, that I shouldn't compare, but love doesn't obey rules, does it? I've built a good life here, but there isn't a single day I don't think of you." And the last one, his handwriting uneven, ink smudged as if by tears. "When I die, I hope you'll forgive me for loving two women. You were my beginning, and she was my end. I never meant to betray either of you, but the war rewrote our lives. I was too much of a coward to tell her the truth. Some secrets die easier than they're spoken." I let the papers fall to the floor. My chest hurt in ways words couldn't describe. He'd loved her still, through our entire marriage, loved her quietly, privately, in the spaces between our laughter. And me? I had been the woman he loved because life demanded he move forward. For hours, I sat there in the dark study, the rain drumming against the window. My mind drifted through decades of moments that suddenly looked different under this new light. The way he'd sometimes whisper another name in his sleep. The faraway look in his eyes each spring when the lilacs bloomed. The very flowers Eliza had mentioned in her first letter. He used to say they reminded him of what could have been. I never knew what he meant until now. But the most haunting realization was this. He hadn't just loved her. He had lived with her ghost, and I'd shared my marriage bed with that ghost every day. The next morning, I took the ring and the letters and placed them beside his photograph. For the first time in my life, I spoke to him not as a widow, but as a woman betrayed. "How could you do this to me, Robert?" I whispered. "How could you let me spend 50 years believing I was your only one?" My voice broke. "You made me your wife, but she was always your forever." The silence in the room was unbearable. I half expected the clock to stop ticking, as if it too pitied me. Then, as I sat there sobbing, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small compartment in the back of the box. I pushed against it, and it slid open to reveal a folded photograph. It was black and white, faded, showing Robert in uniform, standing beside Eliza. She was beautiful, soft curls, bright eyes, the same kind of smile I used to have when I believed in fairy tales. On the back, in faint pencil, were the words, "My wife, Eliza, 1944. If I don't make it back, tell her I never stopped loving her." I stared at it for a long time. I could feel every inch of my heart tearing apart, because I realized in that moment he had never belonged entirely to me. His heart had been split, half buried in that grave in Hampshire, half here beside me. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't hate him. I tried. God knows I tried. But love doesn't just vanish because the truth hurts. Love lingers even when it's poisoned by lies. That night, I dreamed of them together. Not in anger, but in peace. Standing beneath a blooming lilac tree, holding hands. She looked at me, noting with envy, but with a strange sadness, as if she pitied me too. When I woke, my pillow was damp, and the sunrise was bleeding gold through the curtains. I got up, opened the window, and let the morning air in. It was cool, soft, almost forgiving. I whispered to no one, "You had your secret war, Robert. Now it's mine to finish." I decided then that I couldn't let the story end in silence. Eliza deserved more than a forgotten grave. And maybe, just maybe, I deserved answers that went deeper than guilt. I packed the letters, the ring, and the photograph into a small bag. I didn't know where I'd go yet, but I knew there was one person who might hold the missing pieces: our daughter. Because lately, I'd started to wonder if Robert had kept secrets not just from me, but from her too. When I reached my daughter's house, the late autumn sun was already fading. She lived just a few miles away, in the very home Robert and I had helped her buy. For years, it had felt like the continuation of our family's legacy, warm, full of laughter. But that evening, it felt like stepping into a room of ghosts. She opened the door with her usual cheerful voice. "Mum, you didn't tell me you were coming." But when she saw my face, her smile faltered. "What's wrong? You look pale." "I need to talk to you," I said quietly. "About your father." We sat at her kitchen table. The ticking of the wall clock sounded exactly like the one in Robert's study, steady, intrusive, relentless. I placed the small box between us. Her eyes flicked to it, confused. "What's this?" "Your father's secrets," I whispered. As she began to unfold the letters one by one, I watched her expression shift. Confusion, disbelief, sorrow. When she reached the letter that began with, "My dearest husband," her lips trembled. "I don't understand," she said, looking up. "Who's Eliza?" "His first wife," I said bitterly. "Married during the war. He thought she died, but she didn't, not until years later." Her hands shook as she touched the old wedding ring. "You're saying he was married before you? And he never told us?" I nodded. The words still burned my throat. She leaned back, staring at the letters spread across the table. "He used to tell me stories about England," she said faintly. "About the coast, the fog, the lilacs. I always thought they were just stories." Her voice trailed off and something flickered in her eyes. Something I didn't like. A memory, perhaps. "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated, biting her lip. "There's something I never told you," she said. "When I was little, maybe 7 or 8, I found an old photograph in Dad's desk. It was of him standing with a woman. She looked a lot like you, but younger, different somehow. He told me she was an old friend from before the war. He made me promise not to mention it to you, so I didn't." My stomach twisted. "Do you still have it?" She got up and disappeared into her study. A few minutes later, she returned with a faded photograph in her hand. It was the same picture I'd found hidden in his box. Robert and Eliza under a lilac tree, smiling as though nothing could ever separate them. I felt the world tilt. "He kept another copy," I whispered. But as I turned the photograph over, I noticed something new, something mine hadn't had. There, written in small, neat handwriting were the words, "For Lily, so she'll know what real love looks like." Lily, our daughter. My blood ran cold. He He wrote this for you." She nodded, pale. "But I never knew what it meant. I thought he was talking about you two." I pressed a trembling hand to my mouth. Real love. Those 2 words felt like a dagger. He hadn't written that for me. He'd written it to show his daughter the kind of love he'd once had and lost. A silence filled the room so thick it felt like it could suffocate. My daughter finally spoke, her voice cracking. "Do you think he still loved her? After all these years?" I looked at the photograph again. I don't think he ever stopped. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The kitchen light flickered softly, and the smell of rain drifted through the open window. Then, quietly, my daughter said something that broke me completely. "Mom, if he loved her so much, do you think maybe part of him was waiting to go back to her? After death, I mean." Her innocence, her softness, it made the tears spill faster. "Maybe," I said hoarsely. "Maybe he thought they'd finally meet where no lies could follow." But part of me, dark, bitter, couldn't forgive him that easily. That night, back in my own house, I couldn't sleep. The letters called to me from their place on the table. I reread them again and again until the ink blurred under my tears. Then, at the bottom of the last envelope, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. A small, folded note tucked beneath the ribbon. It wasn't a letter, it was a newspaper clipping. "Local war widow dies in tragic fire. Hampshire, 1948. Eliza's house had burned down. They'd ruled it an accident caused by a faulty heater. But as I stared at the photo of the charred ruins, something in me whispered that it wasn't an accident at all. The headline mentioned that she had no family left, no one to claim her belongings. But if Robert had sent money anonymously 2 years later, it meant he'd known about her death. So why send money? Why not go himself? The next morning, I called the Hampshire Records Office again. I asked if there had ever been an investigation into that fire. The woman on the phone hesitated. "There were rumours," she said quietly, "but nothing proven. People said she'd received letters from someone overseas before it happened. Some thought it was her soldier husband. Others thought, well, that it broke her heart when he never returned." When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, the wind howling outside. If she'd received letters, then he must have written them after all. But the ones I found in his box were unsent drafts, which meant the real ones had been sent. And then I thought of something chilling. If he'd written to her after coming home, if she'd learned he was alive, could her death have been more than grief? Could it have been despair? Or worse, silence forced upon her? My head throbbed. I pressed my fingers to my temples and whispered, "What did you do, Robert?" The truth had become a shadow now, long and impossible to outrun. Every time I thought I'd reached the end, another secret unfolded. I'd married a man who'd lived 2 lives, and both had ended in tragedy. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamed of fire, the same fire that had taken Eliza. I saw her standing amid the smoke, her eyes fixed on me, her lips moving without sound. I couldn't hear what she said, but her expression was clear. She wasn't angry, she was warning me. I woke before dawn, trembling, because in my dream, she wasn't burning. She was holding something, a baby, and that image refused to leave my mind. Could there have been something more, someone more, she left behind? The next morning, the dream still clung to me like smoke. Eliza holding a baby, her face calm, not frightened, almost protective. I couldn't shake it. It felt less like imagination and more like a memory that didn't belong to me. I spread the letters out once more, every page like a map leading me deeper into a labyrinth of secrets. And there, in the second letter, something suddenly caught my eye. A line I had skimmed before without thought. The baby kicked today. I wish you could feel it. I think he'll have your eyes. My heart froze. The baby. She'd been pregnant when he left. The thought struck me so hard I couldn't breathe. I read the line again, over and over, as if repetition might dull its blade. But it only cut deeper. There was no mention of a child in any of Robert's letters, no whisper of it in his stories. He had hidden that part completely. If Eliza had given birth before he was declared dead, what happened to the child? Had it died with her in the fire, or survived? I needed answers. I called the records office in Hampshire again, my voice shaking. Can you check for any birth certificates in 1945 under the surname Hayes or Turner? The woman on the line hesitated. Give me a moment, please. The silence felt eternal. Then she returned. There is one record, a boy. Born November 18th, 1945. Mother, Eliza Turner Hayes. Father, Captain Robert Hayes. The child's name? Thomas. Thomas. I nearly dropped the phone. What happened to him? I whispered. According to the notes, the woman continued, he was placed in care after his mother's death, adopted 2 years later by a family named Whitmore. The file was sealed, as most wartime adoptions were. The air around me turned heavy. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes. My husband had a son, a child he never told me about, a living, breathing piece of the life he'd buried. And suddenly, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind, falling into place with sickening clarity. Robert's odd insistence years ago that we donate to an orphanage trust in England. His occasional long-distance calls he claimed were old army contacts. The time he spent hours staring at our daughter's baby photo, silent and unreadable. He had known. He'd known his son was alive. I pulled out one of the old military folders he'd kept, searching for anything that might confirm it. And there, tucked inside a pocket I'd never noticed, was a postcard. A simple coastal view of Hampshire. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words. He found me. No signature, no date, but the handwriting, it wasn't his. It looked older, more fragile. Eliza's. I sank into the chair, the postcard trembling in my hands. If Eliza had written this, it meant she and Robert had made contact before her death. And if she'd written, he found me, then the baby, Thomas, must have been part of it. The pieces started fitting together into something almost unbearable. He returned from war. She was alive. They met again, secretly. She told him about their son. He helped her financially, perhaps through guilt, perhaps through love. But then the fire happened. She died. The boy vanished into adoption. And Robert came back to me, carrying both grief and guilt, and never said a word. By the time I realized I was crying, the tears had soaked through the postcard. My entire life had been built on a story he'd rewritten to protect himself. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't eat, I barely slept. My daughter called, worried, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her everything. Not yet. The truth wasn't ready to be spoken aloud, not until I knew what had become of Thomas. Through old military directories, I found the name Whitmore again, an adoption record linked to a coastal town outside Southampton. The trail was faint, but it was enough. I called the local parish, explained that I was tracing a family connection, and after several calls, an elderly parish clerk confirmed something that made my knees give out. Yes, the Whitmores had a boy, Thomas, he said. He passed away a few years back, but his son, David Whitmore, still lives here, owns a small antique shop near the harbour. A grandson, Robert's grandson, my husband's blood. The next morning, I packed my bag again. I felt old, fragile, but the need for truth burned stronger than my fear. I booked the first flight back to England. The harbour town was small, picturesque, wrapped in fog. The antique shop stood at the corner of a narrow street with a wooden sign that read, Whitmore and Sons, since 1969. Bells chimed as I stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a man in his 30s, polishing an old clock. He looked up, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. The curve of his jaw, the steady blue-grey eyes. It was like seeing Robert again in younger form. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked politely. I hesitated, clutching my bag. "Perhaps you can. I'm looking for information about your grandfather, Thomas Whitmore." He smiled softly. "Ah, Grandad Tom. Everyone loved him. Kind man. Bit mysterious about his past, though. Said he was adopted during the war. Died before I could ask too much." My throat tightened. "Did he ever mention where he came from?" The man thought for a moment. "Not directly, but when I was little he used to tell stories about a soldier father who never came home and a mother who died in a fire. He said her name was Eliza." The room spun. My knees buckled slightly and I gripped the counter to steady myself. "Are you all right, ma'am?" I forced a trembling smile. "Yes, I'm just overwhelmed." He reached under the counter and pulled out an old wooden box. "Actually," he said, "you might appreciate this. It belonged to my grandfather. Found it in his attic years ago. There's a locket inside. Had the initials RH and ET on it. He said it was all he ever kept from his parents." I took the box with shaking hands, opened it, and saw it, the same intertwined initials engraved in gold. Tears blurred my vision. "I knew them," I whispered. The man looked puzzled. "You knew my great-grandparents?" I nodded slowly, my voice barely more than a breath. "Yes. Once upon a time. I loved him too." He frowned gently, unsure what to say. I placed the locket back in his hand and smiled through my tears. "Keep it safe. It's a piece of two souls who were torn apart by war." As I turned to leave, he called out, "Ma'am, what was his name, the soldier?" I paused at the door, my heart aching. "Captain Robert Hayes," I said softly. His eyes widened. "That's the name engraved inside the locket." And in that moment, I knew there was no more doubt. The past had finally spoken through time. As I stepped into the cold air, the sea wind whipping at my hair, I felt something lift inside me. A sadness, yes, but also a strange peace. Robert's secret had finally found its way back to the world. When I returned home for the last time, the house didn't feel like a prison of memories anymore. It felt like a witness. The walls had heard everything, my laughter, my anger, my grief. But now they held silence, the kind that settles only when truth has finally been spoken. I placed the photograph of Robert and Eliza on the mantel, beside our own wedding portrait. 2 different lives, 2 different beginnings, both bound by the same man and the same promises. For years I had hated that attic, hated what it revealed. But now I felt gratitude too, because without those letters, I would have never known who he truly was, flawed, human, torn between love and guilt. I lit a candle beneath his picture. "You lied to me, Robert," I whispered. "But you also loved me, in your own way. And maybe that's the cruelest part, knowing both can be true." The flame flickered softly, like an old friend breathing one last time. I thought of Eliza's grave, forgotten and cold, and of her son, Thomas, who grew up never knowing the full truth. Then I thought of David, the grandson who had Robert's eyes, standing in that antique shop, smiling politely at a stranger who was, unknowingly, his step-grandmother. Life had tied us all together like threads of a tapestry, frayed, uneven, but connected nonetheless. Over the next few days, I gathered everything: the letters, the photos, the ring, the locket. I wrote a long letter of my own, addressed not to Robert but to both of them. You loved each other in a world that was breaking apart, and though that love was buried under ashes and lies, it still found its way back to the light. I forgive you both, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same box where his secrets once lived. Then I drove to the coast, our coast, the one Robert and I had visited every anniversary, the place he said made him feel closest to heaven. The sea was calm that day, the horizon wide and merciful. I sat on the rocks, opened the box, and let the wind take one letter at a time. The pages danced across the waves like white birds, carrying decades of silence into the open sky. When the last one was gone, I took Eliza's wedding ring and held it tightly. "You waited for him, and I lived for him," I murmured. "Maybe now you both can rest." I kissed the ring, then threw it into the sea. It sank without a sound, disappearing into the depths where even secrets lose their shape. For the first time in months, I felt light. That night I dreamed again, but this time there was no fire, just a field of lilacs beneath a soft golden sky. Robert was standing there, young, whole, smiling the way he used to when I first met him. Beside him was Eliza, radiant, holding the hand of a little boy with his eyes. They all looked at me, not in shame, not in sorrow, but in quiet gratitude. He mouthed the words I'd longed to hear. "Thank you." When I woke, the morning sun poured through the curtains like a blessing. I walked to the window and opened it wide. The garden below was blooming with lilacs. He must have planted them years ago, but they'd never blossomed this fully until now. Their scent filled the room, sweet and heavy, like forgiveness. I sat at my writing desk, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and began a letter, not to the past, but to the future. "To my daughter, Lily," I wrote, "and to those who will come after us. The truth doesn't destroy love, it reveals its depth. Your father was not perfect. He was a man broken by war, haunted by ghosts, and guilty of silence. But he also built a family that loved him until his last breath. Remember him not for his lies, but for his humanity. And if one day you meet a man with his same blue eyes and the name Whitmore, tell him the truth, that his blood carries both tragedy and love, and that both are worth remembering." I sealed the letter and placed it with the box. Someday, when I'm gone, she'll find it, and she'll know that the story didn't end in betrayal. It ended in understanding. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how love changes shape. Sometimes it burns, sometimes it hides, and sometimes it survives by weaving itself into other lives. Robert's love for Eliza hadn't erased his love for me. It had simply existed alongside it, buried but breathing, like a second heartbeat beneath his chest. And perhaps that was what war did. It didn't just take lives. It fractured them. It forced people to love in pieces. When the clock struck midnight, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I looked up at his photograph one last time and smiled. "You finally found her," I whispered. "Now it's my turn to find peace." I closed my eyes, listening to the faint hum of the wind through the lilacs outside. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice, soft and steady as it had been all those years ago. "Thank you for loving me anyway," he seemed to say. And that's how I knew my story, and his, had finally come full circle. Love, betrayal, forgiveness. They were never opposites. They were simply the same truth told from different hearts. The letters were gone, but their words lived on in me. And as I drifted into sleep, the house felt warm again, the silence no longer heavy but peaceful, as if the ghosts had finally gone home.